if I can give any advice to any young athlete out there, go somewhere highly qualified and get evaluated. Make sure you understand what they're evaluating, why they evaluated it, and what that means for you. If you want to piecemeal it after that because you're really, driven and you want to have ownership over it and you feel as though no program's going to give you that ownership, fine. But at least you know where you're starting and how you're designed to move.
Hey guys, today I am joined by Dr. Nick Serio. Nick is a renowned sports performance coach, educator, and the founder of Velo University, which is a cutting-edge training platform dedicated to helping baseball athletes unlock their full potential. He's got a doctorate in sports and exercise science. He has become a thought leader in the areas of velocity development, injury prevention, and athlete development for both youth and elite level athletes. His expertise spans a wide range of critical areas, including strength and conditioning, mental skills training, sleep optimization, and nutrition for high-performance athletes. He is an advocate for long-term athletic development. Dr. Serio has developed innovative programs that prioritize both peak performance and sustainable career growth, helping athletes maximize velocity while also minimizing injury risk, which I think is a very important point that you guys will hear today. Dr. Serio's work has been featured in numerous studies, and he is well respected in the baseball community for his research-driven approach to player development. Something that I also think is valuable here is he also specializes in Tommy John prevention and rehabilitation. He offers valuable insights on how young athletes can stay healthy and avoid the overuse injuries that become increasingly common in today's game. So who's this episode for? This episode is for whether you're a player or parent, anybody who has a young amateur travel ball player who's looking to learn more about their body. One of the most important things that we talk about in today's episode is the importance of being evaluated by one of these strength and performance centers. So you guys are going to love this episode. It is an interesting one, and I hope you enjoy. So now to the show. All right, so we are joined today by Dr. Nick Serio. Nick, appreciate you coming on. Can I call you Nick, or do I need to call you Doc?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just Nick.
I love it. Nick. I feel like we got so much to talk about today. One of the things I love about really your level of expertise is it's in a wide range of different areas. It's in obviously strength and conditioning, mental skills training, sleep optimization, and nutrition, all for athletes. As we get going here, I guess I want to know from you, you understand the space, right? You get athletics, you get baseball. What would you find to be the most valuable thing we can kind of get into to start that you think would benefit a lot of these players and families? Is there something that's like front of mind?
Well, I think time is most important. And then, because I think a lot of people waste it, especially at the younger levels, right? And then I would say, like, as you escalate in baseball, trying to manage the mental landscape is likely the most difficult aspect. I think as you can get to these narrowing points in the funnel, so I can play high school baseball at a varsity level, right? Then I'm lucky enough to play college baseball. The further up the funnel you go, the less delineation there is between skill and the greater delineation there is between staying healthy and like control of their mental landscape, right? So you just see bigger gaps in those areas the higher you go, whereas on the lower levels, generally skill delineates most.
So when you work with these players, actually, let's do this for a second. Let's assume, because I know a lot of my listeners, there are, parents and players that are between 10 to 12 all the way up until like 18 years old. So if you're talking to somebody who has heard of what you guys do and is interested in like, yeah, I could see myself maybe working with these guys, what would that process look like? Like, take us through kind of that journey of somebody who's coming in for the first time, how you would work with them, at least in the infancy stages, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So first and foremost, they're going to go through an evaluation, right? The evaluation is imperative because it provides us starting data points, baselines, right? That we can at least begin to build our first sort of phase or transition period with this athlete, just really a discovery period with them, right? And then it also provides us an indication of where the athlete stands, right? So I always say the objectives of the evaluation are threefold. Number one, I want to learn who you are and why you want to be in this building, right? Number two, I want to understand where do you compare to people of your same age, other athletes of your same age that we have worked with. So, we've been training baseball athletes now for 15 years under a previous different name for a while, and then obviously branded it as VeloU. So we have thousands of data points that we're using to compare these athletes to those type of athletes that have come in our building. And then the final piece of that is trying to uncover exactly where should we be heading next. Okay, what is the path that is going to be best suited for this individual? So that's the evaluation period, right? Those are the goals of that. From there, you build this sort of preliminary approach, which is an outline of the type of individual you have, where you think you're going to push them. But then the true art of coaching is understanding how is this individual adapting to what I'm trying to apply, and then how am I going to adjust the program so that I can make sure that their progression is constantly moving in a forward direction.
So as you're talking, one of the things that's coming to mind, and I love that you just described coaching as kind of like an art form, because I think that when you talk about coaches like at the next level, right? Let's just say minor league baseball or the big leagues, to no fault of their own, but I feel like they have this aura around them where it's like, do what I say, right? Like, I am the boss. You listen to me, do what I say. And what I find interesting and what I love about your perspective on it being an art form is I can see you're basically saying, look, I have something to teach you. Are you willing to commit to learning this thing? And those are two different perspectives. If you're the player, if you're the player hearing it from the coach in pro ball, you can see how it's very easy for that player to feel like defensive, like, well, it doesn't work for me, right? Like you're shoving it down my throat. Where what you're suggesting is like, it's almost like an invitation. I'm inviting you into this concept. We trust, given the studies and all these different data points that you just mentioned, we trust that this information is going to help you. Are you willing to buy into it?
Yeah, I'll take it a step further. You said I have something to teach you. Are you willing to learn? I'm actually admitting in the eval, I have an enormous amount to learn about you. And that's not going to happen in this 90 minutes that I'm meeting you right now. But what I can promise you in the first 90 minutes is I can tell you in generality forms where you're headed. But what I want to do is show you where we need to head in order to get to these next levels. And I'm going to have to learn a lot about you over the next month to 90 days in order to really refine how long is it going to take us to get there? Are we really going to be able to get to these levels? And is this something where we're going to go back to the parent? We're going to have a conversation that, like, listen, we're never getting to this period of time, like this level of what you're looking for them to accomplish for these reasons. A lot of where my doctorate comes into play, right? The performance psychology piece is over that first 90 days. Even with an employee, right? Every new broom sweeps. Every kid, when they come into a building, is gung ho and ready to rock and roll, and they want to give everything. What do they look like 30 days in when it's starting to get really hard? What do they look like 60 days in when they feel like they've been doing some of the same things with minor tweaks to them? And even furthering that, what do they look like when they're not doing sexy exercises because they have certain deficiencies that we're trying to hammer right away to get them in a position where we can get to some of these more higher level exercises? So it's a lot about uncovering who am I working with, and how are they going to adapt to the program I'm applying. I think when we're talking about these higher levels, they're constantly trying to build models, okay? And they're trying to fit guys into their models. And that's fine if you want to do that, but then draft a guy that fits your model. Don't draft a guy and then try and fit him into your model. It's not going to work. And you're going to end up either hurting him or you're going to end up making him hate the game and you. And like
Right.
you said, not trust the process. At the end of the day, I genuinely believe there is no one size fits all. I don't believe that there is a perfect mechanics model. I don't believe that there is a one way to train certain people. I think that there's underlying or rather overarching principles that we must follow. But at the end of the day, you can watch many different body types execute very similar things at very high levels.
Do you find that the majority of people that come to you, and I think this may apply for everybody kind of in your space, regardless that your name is VeloU, but do you find that the
Yeah,
majority of people come to you, especially when they're pitchers, it's like, hey, we want to go from throwing, 86 to 92. Like, can you help us?
I believe it's 91.3% come in the door asking for velocity. The only reason I know that, we just had a meeting the other day going over one of our marketing funnels, and it's who is answering what when they come in the door. I think it's like 4% are asking for nutrition, and the other little gap there is talking about health.
We obviously spoke before this, and I think we share a level of concern for some of these younger pitchers who are chasing the velo, right? I
Mhm.
had Eric Cressy on the podcast recently, and one of the things that he spoke about is there's all these different studies that he was mentioning. And there was one, and it was really talking to just about like the increase in velocity from 2002 to 2022 and that 20-year stretch. And, I had Dr. Meister on the podcast, and we spoke about like all the injury and all the Tommy John and all these things. So, like, all of those topics and things are pretty well known in the industry. Knowing that stuff, when you get these players that come in searching for this velocity, what is your feedback to them? Is there a healthy way to develop velocity?
Sure, but it is incredibly difficult, and not everybody's built for it. And I think that's a really tough conversation. So let me try and clarify that a little bit further, right? So, is there a healthy way to increase somebody's velocity? Yes, but they need to have the A prerequisite genetics to sustain the forces that are going to go through their body in order to create that velocity. B, they need to develop that, I would argue, over a more gradual period of time as opposed to a sharp spike in that velocity. And then, ultimately, we need to uncover where are they starting from, and then where do we need to get them to. And I think the issue in a lot of situations is that we're trying to go from 67 to 85, right? Those are the kids we see the major injuries in. Their body is just, it's a vastly different human being, right? The kid that comes in that's throwing 67 to 72 miles an hour and he leaves that winter throwing 85, that is a dangerous scenario that we often have very serious conversations with the athlete and the parents to get them to understand that we don't have the length of time needed. If our objective is to develop that velocity, right, we don't have the length of time needed in the off season to also develop the sort of volume or stress tolerance on the arm, especially when you're talking about innings pitched during that time period. So this athlete, when they go back out into playing, they need to understand they've probably been built up to maybe at a top end of 40 pitches, experiencing that high level of stress load on the body, right? So they have 40 pitches under their belt, maybe over the span of 4 weeks, where they've expressed this new 85 miles an hour. And then they're going to go out game one and throw 78 to 90 pitches, come back 5 days later and do it again. That is a vastly different stress load than the last time they pitched 70 to 90 pitches at 72 miles an hour. And we have to remember that the body takes time to adapt to that kind of volume, to that kind of stress load, repeated stress load. And I think that's a lot of times where we see these injuries. Now, I'm not sitting here saying it's the pitch count, right? It's most likely the stopping of testing how is my body adapting to the stresses I'm applying. So what I mean by that is in the off season, right? Our guys are jumping on force plates every single week. They're testing their arm strength every single day they come in the building. Okay. So we have unbelievable guidance as to how is this athlete actually adapting to the stimuluses we're providing. And we can adjust each day in terms of how we're going to apply the new stress, right? For example, he throws a bullpen on a Tuesday. He throws 30 pitches in that bullpen. We roughly stayed between 75 and 85% in that bullpen. The response was a 5% drop in his total arm strength. Okay, cool. That's not terrible. We're going to come back on Friday. And what do we notice for our next bullpen on Friday, or a longer bullpen, let's say on Friday, is that we've actually now at this point fallen 7% off from that time. We're not going to throw that bullpen today because we've gotten outside of our window where we feel safe that there's not likely an issue that's at hand here, or we're just not recovering. So now we can adapt and we can make changes. People would argue, oh, okay, how are we supposed to do that at the high school level? I was a high school coach for 12 years. Don't get me wrong. That's one of the worst jobs in the world because you got 30 kids that you're trying to manage. And now I'm bringing up something so granular that you're trying to look at. My pushback, and something I never did enough of while I was coaching at the high school level, kids are incredible, incredible at adhering to routines when you make the purpose of the routine very impactful. And if they understood that this could keep me healthy, you could educate them how to do that test on their own, understand the metrics on their own, and be able to do it. And the only reason I can tell you that wholeheartedly, we have over 200 guys in our in-house population. Every single one of them test every single day. Every single one of them understands exactly what is good and what is not, and when they're allowed to throw and when they're not. Does it take time? Yes. Does it take an enormous amount of time? No. But I'm talking that ranges from age 12 to 25.
So going back to the example you gave where the kid comes in throwing 67 and he gets to 85 and how that's a huge risk. And you mentioned obviously time again as being one of the problems. Do you get players that come in for like an off season and like, all right, we're going to work with you for 4 months, right? We want to increase our velocity as much as possible in these 4 months. Like, go. Is that kind of what they're suggesting they want?
In the first few years we were open as VeloU, we had an enormous amount of those scenarios. We still get those scenarios when they come in for evaluations. The only problem is we don't offer that.
Got it.
You got to work with us for 9 to 12 months. If you're going to work with us for 3 months, it's intentionally very cost prohibitive. And we won't put you anywhere near a Velo building.
Do you do remote training?
Yep.
You do. Okay. So if you were somebody, let's just say from California, and they love this concept and they want to work with you, they obviously don't have the time or the money to fly to go see you. How does that process work?
So we do a very, very extensive remote evaluation that is actually significantly longer than our in-house evaluation because we have to gather other metrics that, or other movements that we just, maybe get solved by a force plate or by a, 10-yard sprint on a laser timer, stuff like that, right? So we have to go much more in depth and have almost a deeper conversation with the athlete to try and uncover stuff. In often situations too, we will try and get the athlete to fly in, just explaining to them the difference in magnitude that we can provide in-house. And because of that, actually all of our remote plans afford an athlete to come in twice a month as part of it. So our objective is to actually try and get them in-house so that A, we can get hands-on, and then B, we can test them when they're coming in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then is that for like a day or two? Is it for like a weekend?
Yeah,
twice a month?
actually, they get twice a month, so it's any day, it's any 2 days in a month. So a lot of times we'll get our remote athletes will fly in for a weekend, and they'll come in, Friday, Saturday, something like that, and then they'll stay for those 2 days, and we'll test. Or we have a lot of remote athletes that are 4 hours away, 5 hours away, 10 hours away, and they'll make a drive, once a month or twice a month to come in and test and throw, and especially as we get closer to the season. And then our college guys will utilize that year round. So anytime they're in a 12-month, they get to come in on any break that they have, and they get to stay the whole time.
Do you guys find that, and maybe this is the case because of the name of the program, but do you guys find that you work more with pitchers than hitters?
Oh, definitely. We have a lot of two-way guys in high school and college, but in pro, really the only position guys we'll work with is catchers.
Got it. Okay. That makes
We have
sense.
it. We have a division of our company called Backstop U as well. So we train really catchers, pitchers, and then we work with a lot of position guys from a obviously a throwing velocity perspective, but also a speed perspective, running speed.
Got it. Okay. So let's transition and talk a little bit about the strength training component.
Mhm.
I mean, what's your philosophy or what's your opinion on what's like the right age for these guys to start working out? These
Well,
kids.
I have a 10-year-old, and we started at age 8. And the only reason we started at age 8 was he seemed mature enough to do some things. I think the biggest misconception when it comes to strength and conditioning is that people often presume that always means weight, right? The initial stages of any strength program is movement literacy. Do I understand how to control my center of mass? Do I understand how to manipulate it? Can I transition easily between an agility drill to a straight up linear sprint drill to a jump drill to can I manipulate my center of mass in a squat the right way? How am I designed to move? And at a young age, they're kind of like these amoebas, right? Like they can be refined, they can be, just taught an array of positioning. And then as they age and we get like, bone ossification and we get certain things start setting in, you're going to see structural differences really start to show their true color. And I think what's so important during that time is actually recognizing how does their body want to move, and let's not train everybody the exact same way. We just had an evaluation yesterday with a professional pitcher, throws 100 miles an hour, but is really, really struggling with some hip discomfort. And, I asked them simple questions. I like simple too. I think a lot of times people try and get way too granular for no reason when the answer is right in front of you. I said, when did the hip pain start? He said, 2 years ago. Okay. Well, you got drafted 2 years ago. Yeah, it was really the first time I ever started working out. Okay, cool. So, number one, that sends a lot of signals to me like, okay, this player isn't going to be somebody that's going to respond to like a heavy, dense strength training program that we just, want to hit the ground running and try and tweak a bunch of things, right? So the next, I said to him, okay, so, when you started lifting, what really bothered your hip the most, or when did you start to notice these things? And he's like, oh man, I hate squatting, but they were on me to like squat deep and, do all these different things. And I had to, hold these lunges with a lot of weight and blah, blah. And granted, this is, I'm not blaming anybody, right? I'm merely like trying to take in information. So as we take in information and we have this individual jump on the force plate, right? We notice that his counter movement depth when he goes into jump is extremely shallow upon our standards. Okay, when you notice his walk and his gait and everything like that, you can clearly see he's very retroverted at the hip, meaning the hips are angled back and somewhat externally rotated. He's going to be a terrible squatter. Squatting is going to be incredibly detrimental to his structure. He also has never lifted. And when you put this individual on a force plate, he jumps out of the building. So he's a power based athlete through and through, and he weighs over 200 pounds. So, this ideology that I have to lift and I have to do these things, I think is so flawed the higher up you get. At the younger ages, sure, you need to develop this foundation. Certain people need to push their genetic ceilings. But I also think that a lot of people don't like to admit that there are just very large genetic differences among some people. And some people just don't have to do the same things in order to get the same kind of result.
Interesting how you brought this up because I was just talking to Liam Hendricks, who's one of my clients. And Liam is a guy, if you've ever met him or seen him in person, like he's a really thick guy, really
Mm-hmm.
strong.
Yeah.
Uh, he's from Australia. Dad played Aussie rules football, so he's a pretty stacked guy. And for the longest time in his career, like he hasn't really lifted weights. He does a few things here and there, but for him, it's all about throwing. And what's crazy about that is even as I'm saying it, I can see people who hear that and say, "Oh, I'm going to try that." And it's like, "Well, hold on a second. Like this works for him and he didn't always do it this way. He tried to lift early and there were some things that he noticed about how he felt, and so then he ultimately came to this place as a pro where he realized this is what works for me." And so I love that you're sharing some of this stuff because what I hear you inviting people into is like, if you use the term archetype, like everybody has a certain archetype, and we really need to make sure that whatever we're doing with our bodies is as closely designed to you as you could possibly get.
Yeah, I mean,
And
essentially, that is what the first 90 days are about for us. Like, we are really trying to uncover. You have some basic movement patterns that have been ingrained in you at birth, right? They're evolutionary, right? Nobody taught. I have a 10, 6, and 2 year old, right? Nobody taught them how to jump. Nobody taught them how to run. Nobody taught them how to, push, pull. Nobody taught them how to throw. All of these things they were born with. And they discovered them, right? They uncovered, how should I do this? Maybe that was through watching. Maybe that was innate, just expression, whatever it is. But as you age, right, if we're not overcoached during those times, our body will naturally try and find the best pattern to execute the objective we want to do. Right. So if my objective is to jump as high as I can, and I haven't been overcoached in how to do that, I promise you, your body will try and figure out the best way to execute that humanly possible. And it'll push you into your sort of structural line. So what I'm getting at there is, we have guys that come to us just like that kid that we're talking about, and they've been taught to squat super deep because we want full range of motion, we want this, we want that. Their hips, their pelvis orientation, the way the femur orients with the pelvis, it's just not designed to really handle that, right? It's an incredibly internally rotated dominant positioning that's necessary, and when you don't possess that, that's really not going to be very comfortable. And that's how you create hip impingements, hip lesions, so on and so forth, right? And I think at the end of the day, we have these pre-designed ways that we want to move, and I need to uncover, how is that going to work for me? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm going to be the most fluid in that, and I'm going to be the most authentic in that, which means I'm going to have to think the least in those movement patterns. And I'm not going to be holding back. I'm going to be able to express my truest form of power. And I think at the end of the day, where most people get stuck is they're going to go on YouTube and they're going to listen to what Trevor Bauer trains like, or they're going to listen to how Hendricks trains or didn't train, right? And they're going to apply those to themselves. If I can give any advice to any young athlete out there, go somewhere highly qualified and get evaluated. Make sure you understand what they're evaluating, why they evaluated it, and what that means for you. If you want to piecemeal it after that because you're really, driven and you want to have ownership over it and you feel as though no program's going to give you that ownership, fine. But at least you know where you're starting and how you're designed to move.
would you say because I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm thinking about the family in middle America who's like, we can't afford to do an evaluation, right? And they're also still trying to figure out, but we do want to figure out how we can like strength train in the proper way. I do know some of these families that are even saying that, but they also go to all of these showcases and these tournaments, spending all this money. So where would you put the importance of doing this evaluation next to an event if the kid is, let's just say, 13, 14 years old? Because it sounds like, if I'm hearing you right, and I like, give me an example of, and you don't have to tell me your price, but like, what's an example of like a cost of like getting an evaluation, like
Well,
around,
a 90-minute in-house evaluation, first of all, comes with an enormous amount of information, including you're going to throw on TrackMan. We're going to give you a full TrackMan report, analysis of, your pitch profiles, how they should be mirrored off of your fastball, what that means for you. And obviously, these are more in depth the older you are, right? Like the pro guys get an analysis of everything they've done over the last couple of years and blah, blah, blah. That's $250, right? And then it's I think 150 for a 60-minute, which wouldn't include like throwing on TrackMan. The remote evaluation, I believe, is $100 and often discounted into the realm of like 50 to $25, just because we're trying to recruit more people to come in, but I can't tell you how valuable that would just be just to pay for that. Like, even if you're just paying for that, just get that. Now, you asked me, where would I compare that to like going to a showcase? If there was a number high enough, it'd be 1 billion to 1 would be the
right,
ratio.
right.
Uh, the showcase is so utterly unimportant at that age. It is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah. The question I'm asking is really a rhetorical one because obviously
Right.
I agree with you. Like, you know, think about it. One of the things that we do for a lot of our guys is there's a guy to Southern California who like, test, and there's a lot of people that do this, but they test blood and they tell you, how is energy created? Well, what is your body digesting? What is it not? All these different sorts of things. And what ultimately you're getting is this huge list of all these different things that you wouldn't otherwise know. And by one example is like, oh, you know what? You shouldn't eat bananas because your body actually can't digest this banana. And I'm using that as an example. But if no one gave you that information, you may be someone who eats a banana every day because you're like, this is healthy.
Yep.
This is a perfect example where your body moves a certain way and you're doing an exercise like a squat and you're going deep because on YouTube, that's what they teach, or your high school coach or the strength coach is telling you that's how we do it. And what you don't even realize is every time you're doing that, you're creating more damage. And so for $100, if you're remote, or 250 or 400, that whatever that amount of money was, if you come in house, I mean, if you compare that to going to an event, it is
The return on investment is so far jaded towards one side. It's a laughable ratio.
right.
Um, I'll take it further for people that are like, oh, all right, I get it with strength and conditioning. Let's take it to the pitching development side, right? There's a few accounts that have large followings. We happen to be one of them, right? And we're definitely guilty of creating a lot of that bad understanding because I have 1 minute to get a point across or a minute 30 to get a point across. And I should open it like every time with this is advice and it may not apply to you. Because in all honesty, Paul Skeens is amazing. What a freak. Da, 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 da. Oh, okay. Now I'm watching his warm up. So now I'm going to start doing his warm up every
Yeah, I'm going to
day.
start throwing a football. I'm going to start, yeah.
Right, right. And you're going to throw a football, and you're a guy that, can't supinate to save your life. And now you're just absolutely damaging your arm every time you're doing, being dramatic with it. But my point is, you have these scenarios where I can't tell you how many times we get a kid that comes in and in the eval, if they're doing the longer one, I'm going to watch his warm up. I want to see how meticulous his warm up is. There's two things I can draw out of that. Hey, this is a very motivated and dedicated athlete. Cool. If it's super meticulous and really rigid, oh boy, I got to watch that he's been overcoached.
Mm.
And then then I start watching, okay, like, how's he going to start his warm up? Oh, his warm up starts with these very like static, like throwing warm up, very static throwing motions. He's very precise in what he's trying to do. Well, he's definitely been overcoached. Okay, so we're going to see a methodical mover here. Maybe he might be very mechanically focused, and then he gets on the mound, and on the force plates, he's profiled as a shallow mover, right? We're seeing a tremendous power output out of this kid. He's underweight, so the power is going to be really high. He's relying on speed, right? He's got a lot of internal rotation in the back leg and not as much in the front leg. Okay, cool. And what do I get? I see when we get on the mound this like attempt to get into a real deep squat. He's trying to create external rotation because that's what he's seen on YouTube or on Instagram. And then when he's going to land, he's forcing this big, front side block, but it happens after he throws the pitch. And he literally looks like an athlete who has like been placed each of these pieces together, and he spent days and months trying to perfect that one piece, and now he's trying to combine it into a full movement pattern. I can wholeheartedly promise you that is not how we learn movement. It is the furthest thing from how we're going to do things repeatedly well. And it sucks because, like I just said to you, I know we're guilty of creating some of those issues because I know there's a lot of kids that follow us and they look to some of the drills or sequences that we're trying to put out, or we're like, hey, I worked with this kid. This is how this worked. And they're like, oh, that sounds a lot like me. Let me apply that. So it is a tough battle there. And I don't know the best way to solve that other than to say, as always, I'm happy to communicate with any young athlete to make sure they're not going down a path that is just going to be defeatist, because that is not at all the intention of why we got into this field.
Well, and if I could use the word that you used to start this podcast, which was time, oftentimes I think when players try to model what other people are doing, they waste time, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to go down this rabbit hole and then learn, oh, wait, I shouldn't have been doing that. Then you're going to have to go all the way back and then start from scratch. And again, it's,
If you can,
yeah, right.
if you can.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
that's the other thing that people often confuse is like, so you can't unwrap learned patterns. You're creating blueprints every time you do that, right? You have a large blueprint for throwing, but then when you change the environment, i.e., flat ground to the mound, you have a different set of blueprints that think of it like superimposed over the large one, right? That makes this small adjustment. And every time you make adjustments on that, you're creating a new one, a new one, a new one, a new one. They don't go away, right? Like, in, rather than get into the scientific terms of why they don't go away, those blueprints can't just be thrown out. They're there. They're there to stay. So now you either have to overlap on top of them, or you have to try and change the environment to come back and rewire the whole thing. And it becomes a very incredibly difficult task. And we're not even talking about how the mental landscape impacts our capacity to learn a skill.
So let's get into the mental side a little bit. How do you work with guys from that facet of the game?
I call what we do from the mental side, it's closer to like osmosis. I work a lot with our team to recognize first any sort of holdups or the way they're going about certain things. I'm trying to get them to recognize why they're doing that, and then to be very, very precise with the language they use with those type of athletes, or any type of athlete, really, right? Language is our most powerful asset. 75 to 90% of it is nonverbal, right? And so just body language, tone, the distance I am talking from you, the volume at which I'm talking, all of these things are so important. And they work to develop the relationship between the coach and the athlete, which is arguably the most important thing, right? The number one goal of every single coach on our staff is to develop vulnerability based trust. It is a trust system where the coach and the athlete both feel they can be vulnerable in front of the other without criticism or without feeling as though they're not being respected in that scenario. And when you can develop that and you can gain that, you have an athlete that is moldable and can really start to take shape and learn different things. So just an example off of like how the mental side can start to impact like skill acquisition, right? There are an enormous amount of kids that start to throw hard at a really young age, right? God-given gift to rotate the torso and shoulder really fast, but they don't have they're throwing hard at a really young age, and it's probably happened before they have enough sort of circulating hormonal response to develop muscle and the necessary brakes and deceleration capacity and honestly stress shielding response to the force they can create. So as a result, they end up getting hurt. And what happens is right before they're getting hurt, and as they go through that period of time after being hurt, right? Maybe they had to get surgery, like all that time period. All they're doing is remembering who they were, and they're understanding that they've lost some of this identity, right? Of what they classified themselves as. It's so crucial for our coaches to understand because they have to realize that the identity they're seeing in front of them, the person they're seeing in front of them is fractured. And we need to help rebuild that. But we also need to understand that the anxiety centered around the mound is going to be exponentially higher because the last time that they threw in a moment where that identity was strong, they threw hard. And if they don't throw hard after their rehab or right away when they're on there, they're not going to believe that this identity is becoming one again or that they have now formed this new identity. So we spend a lot of time working with them and talking with them on how to differentiate the identity, spread it out, remove some of it just from the game of baseball. I use this with my employees too. You're not being acquired as a general manager because you're great at being a general manager, right? You're not being acquired as the catcher, right? Or you're not just a good catcher because your attributes say you are. I can receive really well. I can throw really well. What you are is you're a great leader. You have the capacity to control a field. You have the capacity to understand and perform in high pressure situations. All these attributes are what make you a great catcher. That's your identity, not being a great catcher. It's the same thing for an employee. You're not a great general manager. That's not who you are. Who you are is a person that handles pressure very well, can make sure that their entire team understands what they're supposed to do and that they know that they thoroughly respect them and their time is valuable as well. All these different things, that's your true identity. So that's a lot of what we spend time working with these kids on is basically differentiating their identity and getting them to understand what it really means.
I agree with what you're saying. How do you do that though? Like, how do you
It,
take, go ahead.
well, go ahead. What do you mean? How
I
do I
was just
take
gonna
what?
say, so if you take a kid, let's just say who's dealing with an injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
He used to throw really hard. He is now coming back from surgery. He's rehabbing, and you can tell as you're like working with him through stuff like, oh man, this guy is not in a good place, right? He's lacking the self-confidence. He's like, he just looks like a shell of himself. So, like, can you give me an example of when you recognize that, like what's something that that player would need to understand?
Well, first and foremost, their thoughts are probably extremely irrational. So step one is to bring some rationale to the forefront, right? And that what you have to do is draw that out of them. So what I mean by they're irrational, they're probably very stuck in the past, right? And they're afraid of the future. Okay, so what we need to do is get them to understand what they're afraid of hasn't even happened yet. This is not even a reality yet.
Right.
You're just perceiving that that's going to be your reality. And we need to get them to admit that, believe that, and understand that. That is not an easy task. And that does take time. And I will say, the older the athlete is, the more difficult it is. But once you can establish that and you can get them to reality and you can get them to the present tense and they can focus on the present tense, then you can start to set objectives that you want them to accomplish day in and day out. And we can start to say, okay, what's our objective that we want to do today? How are we going to measure success today? What is that going to feel like? And what happens if we are unsuccessful today? What does that mean for the future? Does it mean that the whole future is shot? Or does it mean that we just need to reevaluate and let's set different objectives for tomorrow?
Yeah, it makes
So
sense.
most of the time when you're talking about performance psychology, it's trying to get the person to be rational about their current environment because they're probably being irrational and living in either way too much of the past and allowing that to impact the future.
Yeah, and a lot of that is just awareness, right? Which, you know, no matter whether we're an athlete or not, being self-aware is it's a skill that you can develop obviously, but it's one that I think a lot of times people lose sight of. There's several different performance or mental skills coaches, I call them generally, who they talk a lot about like your way of being and getting curious about things. Because I think athletes were, growing up, were so competitive that somewhere along the way, we lost our curiosity and it became this like game of there's a task. I want to conquer the task. Did I conquer it? Yes, I have self confidence. Did I fail at it? Yes. Okay, I need to like reevaluate. But there's never, and I liken it to the competitiveness because it's somewhere along the way. I feel like that curiosity that we had goes away, and now it's like you have this laser vision of like, I need to kill this thing. I need to kill this thing, right? Um,
Yeah. I
so
think the real problem is that we treat the game as the application or rather the end result as opposed to just understanding that the game is still part of the process, right? Like if I lost, it did not mean I failed. I only failed if I didn't learn anything from that I can't reapply and
right.
practice and then take back, right? And I think that's sort of what you're getting at is that I'm losing the idea that when I'm going to an event or when I'm trying to accomplish something or win or do something, I can't just take that like I would in practice. And I think this speaks volume to the misconception that people have between practice or training and game. They take this approach, practice and training, vastly different, right? It's very low key. It's very, I'm going through this. I just have to do it. Blah, 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 blah. Whereas this is like, now I want to be the killer. Now I want to, well, wait a minute. You didn't practice flipping this switch. You didn't practice turning this on and off. The greatest competitors in the world can turn that switch on and off. And they practice that in practice,
Mm.
right? They practice that in training. They put themselves into a different mindset. The concept of having a different, even ego or identity, right? So you can sometimes we'll talk with our kids and we'll say, okay, hey, what is your identity when you play as comparison to when you're just existing in life? And I think there's a great quote by Bo Jackson when he's going up to accept an award. And he says, it's kind of funny that Bo Jackson's coming out here to accept this award because he's never run a single play in football. Because in his mind, that's not Bo Jackson out on the football field running. That's a different human. And if you've ever watched the behind the scenes of him or any of those 30 for 30s, and you see how much of a recluse he is, and he's calm and he's tame and but then in a game he's violent, and the ability to become somebody else in that moment, he needed to create that in order to be as great as he was. And that only happens when you practice that and not when you practice it just at the highest stress moment.
Right. I think it was Tom Brady or Peyton Manning recently that was talking about the best teams. I think it was Peyton, if I'm not mistaken. The best teams that he was on were the teams in practice who treated it like a game.
Yeah.
And it was just like you said, high intensity. Like if we're running a play, why are we, because it's practice, taking it easy? And like you said, just going through the motions and being nonchalant about it. Like we have to truly practice it like a game. And he was referencing, when he won a Super Bowl and like that whole journey in that team. So it's essentially what you're saying.
Yeah, it's the same stories that you'll ever hear about Kobe Bryant and how relentless he was in practice, or Michael Jordan and how, they would challenge and get in fights with their own teammates in the middle of practice because they weren't hustling as hard as they needed to, or so on and so forth. And baseball, I think, is really hard because a lot of times we don't have that physicality piece, right? And even as a pitcher, I can't go out if I'm throwing a bullpen and throw my bullpen in 100%. But it doesn't mean that I can't take the mindset at 100% that I want to have on that day.
Mm.
It doesn't mean that I'm not going to still go through my routine in between pitches like I would on the day that I'm going to pitch. All of those things need to exist in that environment before I enter just the high stress moment.
So true. I think for parents who are listening, that is a really, really, really important point, right? If you could stress anything to your kid, it's reminding them that that is the case. Cause we see it. You see it. I see it every day where kids, they just take it easy. And I think on some level, it's this game they play mentally where it's like low stress, don't worry about it. It's all fun. And by the way, like you can compete at a high level and have a lot of fun, right? But just
I made that comment to my son. I said to him, "You want to know what's really fun? Winning.
right.
You want to know what's not fun? Not winning, right?
Yeah.
And getting nothing out of it.
Right.
Feeling like you're defeated at the end of that." See, the people who come out of a game where they just got their ass handed to them and can turn around and it enrages them, not because they're like, I lost, I hate this, like, blah, blah, but it enrages them to go and perfect something that they knew they messed up in that game. The ones who struggle the greatest are the ones who look at that game and feel sorry for themselves.
Mm.
They sit back and they say, yeah, I don't know. I can't throw hard. I can't do this. I can't. Well, what did you do leading up to that? What went into the preparation for this game that was different than the last one? What can you take apart that you can learn from that experience? And ultimately, at the end of the day, that's why winning's fun, because you're just solving the fucking puzzle.
Right.
You're just like, oh, I solved the puzzle really well today. And I got that. Now, in the same breath, the greats are going to look at that and say, there's still so much more I could have done a little bit better. And they get right back to it.
Yeah. If the sexy thing that everybody wants to talk about is velocity,
Mm-hmm.
I would say the most unsexy thing that everybody wants to talk about is nutrition. Is that fair to
Sure.
say?
Yeah.
Right? What do these kids need to know about nutrition? Because I'm going to tell you, for some, I pride myself on, I try to eat healthy, but I
Mm-hmm.
try to put myself in these athletes' shoes, especially when they're in high school, college, minor leagues. And oftentimes they don't have access, or at least it's not as easy to eat healthy as it might be to eat unhealthy. Maybe they're playing in one of these small minor league towns. Game gets over at 11 o'clock at night. Every restaurant's closed, but Waffle House, Denny's, any one of these other fast food joints, right? What do you lead with when you educate these kids on their nutrition?
So, the number one problem when it comes to nutrition, and we're talking about a high school athlete here, is that they're following the advice of their parent. You and I can't eat the same way my 10-year-old can eat, right? And we don't even have the same nutritional aspirations. right? His objective is to gain weight, as is 95% of the kids I see, right? My objective is to not be an out of shape fat dad,
Right.
right? So, like, our eating habits, our philosophy on what we're going to eat is vastly different. And I think what really should be done at the end of the day is simplify the hell out of nutrition, right? And just try and find easy ways to get kids to understand what they need to accomplish in a day in order to trend in the right direction. There's some simple stuff we use. So let's say we get a kid in, he's 175 pounds, he's 6 foot 175, right? And we're noticing that his strength numbers, right? Strength, power, right? These are different, right? In the sense of, like, for simplistic terms, let's just say the power is also accounting for how fast you're
Mm-hmm.
moving that strength, right? So the strength numbers are there, especially per kilogram of body weight, right? When we take body weight into account. But the power numbers are not really there at all. And when we take the strength per kilogram body weight, it's actually really high, but the overall strength is not that high, right? So what we're understanding here is that we're underweight. Okay, and we can't move this mass very fast, right? So we're probably not strong enough, and we can use to really gain some weight here. So what we say is this: look, our objective is to get us to somewhere around 185 pounds over the next, give or take, 10 to 15 weeks. Okay, and what we do in simplistic terms, we start out super basic. Do you have a protein shake that you enjoy, that you take? Because most kids that are going to come in, they're going to be motivated enough to at least have gone down that approach of, yes, I have a protein shake I like. Okay, cool. Well, the objective here is you need to take 185 grams of protein in a day, because that's what we want to weigh. And we're going to start out with that. And what we'll do is we'll track their weight. They're jumping on a force plate every week, right? So it's the most accurate scale on the planet. So what we can start to tell is that, is there an increase in weight over this time period? If there's not, we have to come back to them and say, hey, were you able to take in 185 grams of protein? Because now it's an easy thing for them to track. And we put them through one of our nutrition courses, which also gives them advice on, like, hey, if it's about the size of your hand, and it's, a lean protein, it's going to be roughly 30 grams. So you can start to add these things up, and we make it simple. It's like, hey, have protein shake here, have protein shake there, right? And that's accounting for about 50 of the 185. And now you're going to add these other meals in between, which is just some kind of lean protein on each of these, and you're going to get roughly to the caloric intake we need, rather than sitting them there and saying, hey, we have to count all of the calories, we have to count, the types of food we're getting in. Because the biggest issue is they're not buying the food. The parents are the ones buying the food. So in simplistic terms, we try and get them to get the protein in, because the likelihood, and what we have seen, is that they will get the caloric intake just by trying to do that. So we simplify it there right out the chute, and generally we see the response we need. If we don't, we have them dive in a little bit deeper, and we'll go into what are we taking in and how are we doing it.
No, that's super helpful. I think keeping it simple is probably the smartest thing to do, at least when guys are getting started. The more complex you make it, the more you feel like, oh man, I got to completely like revolutionize my whole eating plan. And as you know,
Yeah.
like that feels heavy to do. So yeah, like helping these kids realize, look, it's just a matter of maybe changing one or two little things, and we'll start there and then reevaluate.
What
Um,
what we have really seen is, if we can account for water and protein intake, everything sort of takes care of itself.
how much
Um,
water?
so again, we'll get somewhere around, like, hey, if you're taking in, we like the pound scenario, right? So if you weigh 175 ounces, give or take, somewhere in there, let's get somewhere close to that over the course of a day.
It's a lot of water.
It's a lot of water, but as long as they won't deplete themselves, right? The other thing is this: they're never going to do it. They're never going to get that close with that amount of water, right? So we're often trying to get them to just get somewhere in the realm. But as long as they're not making it like they're stressing themselves out when it comes to this nutrition period, we're going to trend in the right direction.
Right.
And we're going to start to notice things early, especially if they're in house and we can test them regularly. If they're remote, we'll have a little bit more refined things that we're working on because it's not as easy to constantly test.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if the 175 example, if a kid, let's just say, drank without this advice 50 ounces of water and you tell him he needs to take in 175, he may not get to 175, but maybe he'll get to 150.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
So that makes sense.
Right. They're not going to get all the way there. We also say like account for any other liquid you're taking in. Remember, any liquid counts. So if we're taking in these liquids, let's take them in as part of hydration. Right. So they're going to have a Gatorade, right? We can count that in there. And it's actually going to help make sure that we're not depleting. We often suggest some sodium supplements as well, and just in case that we're not getting the sodium impact that we need to be getting. So a lot of these things get very granular, but as I said to you, they don't really get granular in the first 90 days because we really need to let them flesh out and see what's happening.
Yeah. It sounds like that's the smartest thing you can do. How many people would, hey, let's hurry up and let's get this thing going? And no, I think that's wise that you guys do it that
The
way.
other thing is this: you're dealing with kids, right? So when dealing with kids, they adapt so fast. I can't tell you how many times when people come in, we don't even have a conversation about nutrition. They're underweight, but we don't even have a conversation. The reason we don't is in the first 90 days, what do we see? We start to see basically a 10 to 15-pound gain. Why? Oh, they're burning significantly more calories in a day. Guess what they are? Hungry. So they're going to go home, they're going to eat more. They're going to do these things. Now, if we start to notice their lean body mass changing, that's where we start to have the conversation about protein, as opposed to maybe some of these other calories that we're getting in. And we're trying to find ways to change some of the caloric intake with having to avoid the conversation of this is how many calories you need.
Yeah. All right, bro. I got one last question for you. And it's maybe one that you are most eager to talk about. If you could change one thing about Major League Baseball over the next 5 years, because you've worked with major leaguers before, if you could change
Mm-hmm.
one thing, what's that one thing?
Well, I think what's really difficult is we sit around and we say we have an injury epidemic going on, right? Especially at the younger levels. That is a byproduct of the fact that we now have data, strong data, that supports velocity will get you to not only into college and potentially drafted and get paid more money, but it also will make you perform better in a game. There's no argument there. It just will. Okay, great. But there's consequences to that. The consequences to that is that at a certain, if that's developed at too young of an age, we don't have the structural strength and some of the necessary parameters to handle that. If it starts to happen at a later age, we're going to run into some of our genetic makeup, some of our pre-existing previous injuries, all these different things, right? And essentially, as we funnel, what we start to see is that athletes are basically spending less and less time in Major League Baseball. And I think what Major League Baseball is actually doing is just continuing to narrow that funnel because it's cost prohibitive to keep the athlete there longer, right? They get them the second contract, they got to negotiate, now they have
Mm-hmm.
arbitration, right? All these things. So I think that if Major League Baseball, the moment an athlete was drafted, and he's part of any organization, that athlete now gets into the pension immediately. And I think what you would see is Major League Baseball would take a lot more interest in injury prevention and how to actually treat these injuries or, excuse me, prevent them early on. They would also take a much bigger interest in how they are, I guess, evaluating the potential risk of injury in some of these athletes. Throwing 100 miles an hour at age 16 is a grave risk to eventual injury later on. I think you would start to see a shift where we would be allowed to develop velocity at later ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you would see the shift start to happen at the college level, obviously, first. You wouldn't need to throw, which you do at this point, basically 90 miles an hour to get a Division I offer. You could get a Division I offer throwing 80 to 85 with the idea that I could, maybe not 80, but 85 with the idea that I could develop over that time period and then potentially have the capacity to reach these higher velocities.
Yeah, there needs to be more of an investment in the individual personally, and that sounds like your idea solves that problem. Because if you're a parent on this, and let's just say you're a business person, MLB, in a sense, what's going on, it's like if you were running an accounting firm, imagine if you had a funnel of people that came into your business. You had these people from the time they were 20 to 24. You worked them 20 hours a day. They rested only 4. And you literally abused them for 4 years. And at the end of the 4 years, they burnt out. And so they just quit. And you had a whole new influx of people. So if you had that business, you could just turn up the knob, keep cranking things out. And it's great for your business, but it's ultimately not great for the individuals that have gone through that company. So if, like, that's essentially what is going on in baseball is these teams are drafting these players who have this desire and dream to play in the major leagues. They're treating them as though they're these faceless creatures, right? They're bringing them through the minor leagues. And it's like, look, and I use this analogy on the Meister podcast. You know, I go back and forth. Like, I struggle with blaming these teams because the front office is essentially being tasked with, okay, here's this Porsche. I want you to take apart the Porsche and I want you to rebuild the engine so it drives faster. That's your job. And so what do? That exact thing. And then when the Porsche is now driving faster, now there are obviously going to be consequences to that down the road, but that wasn't their job. Like the whole industry isn't set up to worry about that. So I do like your idea because it's like, well, look, we need to start correcting that issue. And I'll be honest, I think it starts with ownership. Because if you're a general manager that's being hired, you're basically being told, here's the deal. This is what you need to do. Go win. Now go do your thing. And if you can't, you're just going to be let go. So you're being, trained to think this way. And so that's where I think it's going to take these ownerships that are invested and the commissioner who's invested in needing to solve this problem. And look, it's an overwhelming one. It really is.
I completely agree with you. I don't see why an owner would, because an owner is the accounting firm that you
That's
just
right.
talked about. The only thing that we have an advantage here over the accounting firm, which I guess maybe you could say is supposed to be our government, but that's not going to work that way, would be the fact that there is a commissioner and that there is a players union and that they should demand the health be the priority, the long-term health of an individual be the priority. You're starting out at these young ages, right? And I think this is where people don't understand the ramifications. We have kids that leave high school and go into the minor leagues. Okay, they don't ever go towards college. They head into the minor leagues. They spend 5 to 7 years in the minor leagues and are done. What have they done? So, by the way, at this stage, if they haven't gone to college, they're what, 23, 25?
Right.
Now they have the choice. I can go back to school because I'm getting no money from MLB anymore, right? Like, I'm done. I'm not part of anything. I've gotten hurt twice throughout that time period. I didn't, my arm, whatever, like the long-term health ramifications, I'm not as concerned with, but I'm concerned with the financial ramifications here. I think the percentage is unbelievably low of that population that goes back to school,
It is.
right, and actually finish a degree. And then on top of that, they haven't developed any higher education skill sets that provide them an opportunity to enter the workforce anywhere at the age of 25, 26, and where they're being compared, right? Because That's the entire world. Same thing if you come in for an eval. I'm going to compare you to your age. So if I'm comparing a 25-year-old that spent 5, 6 years in the minor leagues to a 25-year-old that now has an MBA, who am I picking?
Right.
It's not even close. The guy who's done the MBA has done 5 internships along that same time period. So the only route you're providing now for this individual is go give baseball lessons. Go lean on your skill that were trained your whole life to get to. That's their livelihood at that point in time
Yeah.
till eventually they enter, maybe, if they don't come from a fortunate family or all these other things, they're going to have to take, jobs that maybe didn't require a college education or things like that. And I think ultimately at the end of the day, the bigger concern isn't just that individual that enters there. It's the downstream ramifications of what we're telling is needed to the high school kid. And sure, I could sit here and anybody listening could be like, well, you're part of the problem. All you're doing is developing velocity. I am trying everything humanly possible. I will spend my last dollar to uncover ways to get these kids to develop velocity as safe as humanly possible because they're going to try and do it anyway. So if I can help them in any facet possible to do that in a very safe manner, that is where I see myself interjecting. That is what our company stands behind. The idea that they need to develop it this young is only because they have aspirations of playing at the next level.
Right. To me, it's a little bit of the chicken and the egg, right? Where I struggle is like, okay, so these youth players, they're obviously looking at the major leaguers and they're saying, what do they do? I want to do that too. And if the game is rewarding velocity at the major league level, then naturally it's going to sprinkle down into the amateur baseball. Kids are going to want to throw harder. When you go to these events, they got the radar gun everywhere. It's
I
all
actually
people
think college is a bigger problem now. I think it's a
then,
bigger problem than MLB because we have just said you got college athletes, pitchers that are making $400,000 a year, and they're broadcasted everywhere now because they throw exceptionally hard. Now, granted, they're a great pitcher on top of it, right? I'm not trying to take anything away from the kid and make your money, but that is a bigger issue at this point than even professional baseball. These guys have arguably larger social media profiles. They got more attention and visibility. It's insane. And I think we're just discrediting the changes that the NCAA is making and how it is literally going to further drive this problem. You just cut the roster size down to 34.
yeah,
You're now stating that you need to be even better to make this squad. It's
right.
a narrower funnel, and you have turned college baseball into single year free agency. You have decimated mid majors.
It really is, by the way. I mean, it true with the transfer portal now, it's free agency.
Well, and the biggest misconception most people have is that they believe that, oh, the transfer portal is the new thing. That's been around. It's just that
Yeah.
now a kid actually has access to changing it himself. But what hasn't existed, and the number one problem is that I can go D1 to D1
Uh-huh.
in the same year.
Right. You don't have to
And
sit out a year. Yeah.
right when that emerged, you want to see, watch, these elbow injuries aren't just going to go like gradually up. They're going to go like this because you're going to have every high school kid. I don't think people give enough credit to how immature their emotional states are. You're going to have every single high school kid from the age of 14 to 18 trying to throw 90 plus miles an hour as fast as humanly possible so that they can get recognized and get a college scholarship. And the worst of it is that if they go to one of those big time schools in the SEC, ACC, Big 12, whatever, and they don't play in the fall,
Oh.
gone,
Yeah, of course.
buried, see ya, gone.
Well, and that's what I mean when I say free agency, because they're going to bring in other kids.
Yep.
What's so wild about like the evolution of college over the last handful of years is, so when we were coming up, if you went to a Power 5 conference, you better go to one where you're like you're not going to play your freshman year, but that was okay because you're kind of getting your feet wet. But you need to
Yep.
play your sophomore year. And that was kind of like the expectation. Like, you may play a little bit. We're going to introduce you to the program, but like, expect come sophomore year that you're going to play. Now, if you go to a school and you do not play your freshman year, I mean, you're hosed, because they're going to bring other guys in to compete with you, which, by the way, there's always going to be competition, and that's fine.
Sure.
But it's just not what you were expecting going in. So when sometimes these players are like, oh, I want to go to this one school that won the College World Series last year and they're stacked, it's like, do you really have a chance to play as a freshman? Because if you don't, it's not going to get easier. And I'm generalizing here. There obviously are these outliers where a kid goes as a freshman, doesn't play, and still able to play as a sophomore.
Sure.
But the more examples I see of this happening, the more I'm realizing, like, yeah, man, the game is changing, and the transfer portal, and to your point, being that you can go D1 to D1 now, where before you'd have to sit out a year, like, that has totally revolutionized things.
Well, I'm sure it's changed your way that you guys look at a highly touted high school prospect. I mean, right now, I can tell you we have maybe like three or four. Every year, we have about three or four that are like potentials to get drafted, right? And I can tell you now, I'm recognizing that the advice across the board now is listen, if you're going to get a decent amount of money coming out of high school, and I mean, that dollar amount has continued to drop, it's advisable to go, because at least you're going to get a couple years to develop who you are in sort of this minor league organization, as opposed to going to a high level college atmosphere, not performing right away and being out of baseball. Like, you're going to go from an ACC school down to a D2, D3, and then what? Hopefully perform well and then have to transfer back up. Think about that road. Think
Yeah.
about how everything has to line up perfectly to get you back into a position just to be drafted.
I will tell you, Nick, a little bit how like you do your eval and how it's a whole process. I can honestly tell you, like, as we advise these kids on that decision, it truly is this like really heavy lift, because as you would imagine, it's a lot of this is trying to analyze, are you a student? What's your
Right.
maturity level
Right.
like? What are
Totally agree. Yeah.
yeah, knowing all of the different things that they're going to face both in college and pro ball, like, you're taking all of this information into account and then listening to him and really trying to guide him to make that best decision. And I can tell you that there are some kids where, like, a couple years ago, we turned down close to $3 million and the kid ended up going to college, and like, hey, the kid's an absolute monster in college and he's a stud. But there are other stories where you took a kid who, said he wanted to go to college, turned down a decent amount of money, and yeah, ends up fizzling out in college and just like is retired in a year. And so there are those outliers that happen,
Yep.
which is why it's not as simple as to say like it's cookie cutter, just like this works for
Sure.
everybody.
Yep.
It's you just got to dive into it. But I love the point you made, because I couldn't agree more. It's certainly it's a slippery slope now, and I'm afraid it's only getting more slippy. The deeper
Yep.
we go into this thing, I mean, the NIL space, it's the wild, wild west, and the transfer portal. There were 4,000 kids in the transfer portal this year. Like,
There'll
that's
be
not,
more next year.
yeah. And like, by the way, I'm sure that's good for some kids, but that's not good. Like, overall, that's not a good thing. So,
You're further embossing the individualistic ideology of baseball, especially at the pitcher position, right? You're
right.
basically stating, I'm my own brand, I'm my own team. I don't have allegiance anywhere. And that is what is beneficial to you, to just go jump ship, go to that place, play, and then try and level up and level up and level up. And I think what you're just eventually going to see, and I don't know, maybe these, I mean, listen, I don't view myself as being that smart. So maybe there's people out there that are behind the scenes of this that understand the ramifications, how they're going to play out. But to me, it looks like we're going to head towards these two or three conferences that are going to be the conglomerates, and everything else is going to sort of be just below them.
Yeah.
Right.
If you look at the NBA going back to like Jordan's day, right? It was a team sport, right?
Yep.
All of those guys played together for several years.
Yeah.
You look at the NBA today, and it is individualized. These guys recruiting their buddies to change teams, and it's truly that. I do agree with you. I think the big leagues has been that for a while now, but at least in college, you still maintained that like team environment. I do see the things that you're referencing, which is now that's becoming more individualized. And now I hate to say it, like even high school is. How many of these kids, they play high school baseball because it's their last opportunity to play with their buddies. But for them, the real fun is in the summer when they're playing tournament baseball, travel ball,
Yeah,
right?
which I don't understand. We always say to them, like, listen, high school is the last time you're going to be treated like you're not in a business. This is the last time you actually get to play a game. Moving forward, like, you go to college, understand one thing:
It's a business.
you're being paid to be there. That's called a job.
Yeah.
Whether you're being paid from a scholarship or you're being paid from NIL and a scholarship, whatever, that is called a job. This is no longer, oh, I really like you because I recruited you. I really like every employee I hire. But all of a sudden, if that's not working out, I'm not just going to keep them because I like them because I recruited them and I'm stuck with them because they live in my area. This
Right.
is, you are going to get cut.
Yeah.
And I think people need to understand the best advice actually comes. A very good friend of mine is one of the pitching coaches for one of those ACC schools, and he called me up after the season and was just like, I just had to let 4 kids go that I recruited, I loved, but I had to let them go because they're never going to play for me, and I need them to go get an experience somewhere else. Right? It was
Right.
like great, genuine human. They didn't pan out. And what he said is, he goes, if you want any advice, tell every single kid that you have in your building to go to a mid major or somewhere where they are absolutely wanted.
Mm.
And if they play and perform because they are wanted at that school, they will have the capacity to transfer up to one of these bigger. But you're basically making those ACC, SEC schools. That's the new minor leagues.
Yeah.
That's the minors before you get into the minors.
Yeah. Well, brother, I feel like we can go on forever.
Yeah,
We're gonna have to have an episode too. But Nick, can't thank you enough, man. I mean, you've obviously given us a ton of information to chew on. I will put your information in the show notes so that everybody knows how to contact you guys if they want to inquire about your services. But yeah, thank you again, man, and enjoy teaching the kids.
yeah, appreciate it. Thanks so much for having this platform and inviting me on it. And I'm excited for our next combo too.
No doubt. All right, brother.